This video is going to look at the effects of recreational drugs on the transmission process within the central nervous system. You need to be able to describe the effects of recreational drugs on the transmission process within the central nervous system and then evaluate it. Drugs are chemicals that have an effect on humans. Now, recreational drugs are called so because they're taken for pleasure, and examples include cocaine, heroin, cannabis, ecstasy, MDMA, etc. They're often known as psychoactive substances because they alter brain function, which changes our mood or perception or conscious experiences. It has long been recognised that the use of such substances leads to an altered state of consciousness, but only fairly recently has it been possible to investigate the effect of drugs on the nervous system. Now, it's important when I'm referring to the mode of action that you understand that this refers to the way that a drug works at the synapse in the brain. Manufactured drugs mimic natural neurotransmitters, and they more or less fit certain receptors, and they are received like neurotransmitters, and the message from those essentially works. Now, these blocking drugs will fit and fill the receptor so that the natural neurotransmitter cannot be absorbed and the message can't be passed on because the receptor's blocked. An example of these types of drugs are SSRIs, which stands for selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors. Now, these drugs are medically prescribed for things like depression. An example may be Prozac, if you've heard of that. Now, these drugs work by controlling serotonin, which is a neurotransmitter that will enhance mood. And this works by blocking the reuptake of serotonin from across the synapse by the presynaptic cell. This leaves more serotonin across the synaptic gap, which means that it will be taken up by the receptors again and again and again, increasing the amounts of serotonin within the brain and therefore improving mood. Now, it's important that you understand the reward pathway when we're referring to the role of drugs on the central nervous system. Now, the brain contains a reward pathway which allows us to feel this feeling of euphoria, and it's a pleasant and rewarding feeling. When we feel this, it encourages us to repeat this behavior again because it activates the pathway. Now, it's said that this is something that's evolved. So, for example, we feel good after we've eaten high-calorie food because that ensures that we store enough fat in our bodies in preparation for periods of famine or when we wouldn't have access to food. However, drugs will hijack this reward system and produce the pleasurable feelings without any necessary adaptive functioning or benefit to us. Now, the drugs will influence the amount of neurotransmitters across the brain by either increasing or decreasing this production. Drugs will stimulate or mimic the effect of the natural neurotransmitters by either acting as an agonist, which will activate the synaptic receptor sites, or an antagonist, which is the opposite and does not activate the synapse receptor sites. Now, drugs will act by changing the way that the neurotransmitters operate across the brain. So, for example, heroin increases the amount of dopamine across the reward pathway of the brain by increasing the activation of the dopaminergic synapses, causing an intensely pleasurable feeling called euphoria. Now, the brain will naturally react to this, and it stops the production of dopamine in the brain in order to counteract this. So if we make a little graph in the corner here, the heroin will make the amount of dopamine go up, and if we say that this line here is where average amounts of dopamine should be. As the dopamine starts to wear off, because the brain has stopped making dopamine, unfortunately the levels of dopamine drop below average. Now, this creates a dysphoria, and this makes the person want to take more heroin so that we can get dopamine levels back up to where they should be, remembering that dopamine controls things like emotions. Now, this is what leads to repeated drug use and causes further downregulation of the drug because the brain will produce less and less every time. And this is what leads to a person becoming physically dependent on the drug and therefore becoming addicted. Now, just a summary of the way that some drugs will act upon the brain. So cocaine will block the reuptake of dopamine into the presynaptic neuron so that more is left within the synapse for the message to continue. Nicotine, again, works across the reward pathway in the brain in order to give us pleasure. And that's addictive because someone will carry out the behavior to stimulate the reward pathway. Nicotine receptors trigger an electrical impulse in a neuron and in the reward pathway, which again releases more dopamine across our reward system. I've got two videos that I have taken from somebody else, so full credit to them, but I just want you to have a look at the way that drugs will impact upon our nervous system.